Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to continue hearing evidence from Mrs. Dexter, formerly Deputy Commissioner of the London Fire Brigade. So could I ask Mrs. Dexter to come in, please? Good morning, Mrs. Dexter.
Morning.
All ready to carry on?
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Mr. Chairman, good morning. Good morning to the members of the panel. Ms. Dexter, good morning to you. Last night when we finished for the day, we were discussing the LFB's response to the investigation of tall and timber-framed buildings by the GLA's Planning and Housing Committee. Can we turn, please, to the LFB's submission to that committee at LFB 001-08144. There it is. It's dated the 5th of March 2010. I'd like to explore some of the contents with you, if I may. Can we turn, please, to page 7? And on page 7, which follows on from questions about the use of timber, this question asks, what risks do other materials and construction methods pose in comparison? And the LFB's response begins...
Sorry, should we just get page 7 up? Right.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm sorry, my one version of mine is slightly ahead of the general. I'll ask the question or put it again. You can see it written down. What risks do other materials and construction methods pose in comparison? And paragraph 28 says, in order to meet the challenging requirements of the modern built environment, many new innovative construction products and techniques, ICPT, are being developed. As with all construction methods, it's necessary to ensure that innovation does not have a detrimental impact on safety. Whilst there is the potential for ICPT to be used in all buildings, they are probably most prevalent in the residential sector. If we go on to paragraph 29, Ms. Dexter, just below that, it says this: the main forms of ICPT used for residential buildings include, and then you can see 4 bullet points, light steel frame, timber frame, and then this, structural insulated panel systems, SIPS. And then paragraph 30, whilst the list is not exhaustive, there are some primary concerns from a firefighting and fire safety aspect. And then if you look at the first bullet point, it says, it says innovative structural forms sometimes mimic traditional construction, and the Brigade may not be aware of the nature of the building and the key structural elements. And the second bullet point says this: the increasing use of polymeric materials in building construction. The reduced fire performance of some polymeric materials can provide a route for fire to spread by bypassing cavity barriers or fire-stopping measures. This issue is relevant to external walls, cladding systems, internal walls, and cavities between floors. Now, just pausing there, would I be right in thinking that from reading that, as of early March 2010, your fire safety department, and indeed other senior officers in the LFB, were aware of the fire risks associated with insulated panel systems and cladding systems in the modern built environment?
That's a reasonable inference based on that text, yes.
Well, was it so as a fact?
I can't speak to that, Mr. Millett. I don't think I was very involved in this. I think I was. I probably reviewed it and I probably commented on it, but I don't recall an intense involvement in this, and it was in the early days of my appointment. So I don't think I can offer you anything on that.
Right. Would you also accept that, as at that time, early March 2010, that your fire safety department and other senior officers at the LFB were aware that there was a risk not only of potential fire spread, but also of the Brigade being unaware of that when attending an incident?
Yes.
Yes. Was that risk, the building risk and the ignorance risk, ever communicated to operational crews?
I'm not aware that it was communicated in terms such as that, no. But I have to say, I can't speak to the extent of the risk that was known amongst the fire safety team and or some senior operational or senior officers. So I genuinely don't know whether this was something that they had begun to see emerge or where they had a substantial body of evidence, as it were. I don't think it was the latter, because I think I would have known more about that, would know more about that. But I can't be certain on those points.
Just looking at the first sentence of your answer, where you said, I'm not aware that it was communicated in terms such as that. No. Are you telling us that you knew that it wasn't? Or are you telling us that you don't know one way or the other whether it was or whether it wasn't?
The latter rather than the former.
Why didn't you know one way or the other?
Because I don't feel like I can be absolutely certain that the next document that you present to me won't be, an email to all operational staff dated October 2010 saying, please be aware of this. I'm just not certain on that point. I don't believe it is the case, but I'm simply and only saying I'm not certain. I think it's unlikely. I think I either would be likely to recall it or would have been likely to have discovered it during the process of preparation, and nothing comes to mind that fits that bill.
Ms Dexter, I wonder whether you've quite understood what this process is about. I'm asking you questions to elicit what you knew looking back on it at the time to the best of your recollection. It would be, I think, more helpful to us if you didn't try and anticipate documents I might or might not put to you, or documents you might or might not have read in the course of your preparation. Is that, do you see what I'm driving at?
I do, but I'm slightly wary about saying I definitely, this thing that didn't exist when I can't be 100% certain about whether something existed or not.
No,
that's the only point I was trying to make.
Right. All right.
You might feel that the response could be, as far as I remember,
yes,
no.
Okay.
And then if it subsequently transpires that your recollection here and now is not accurate, we shan't hold that against.
I'm sorry, I thought that's what I was doing, but I obviously haven't done it very well. I'll
it's,
try harder.
It's very difficult, I do understand, and we're asking you about things that happened quite a long time ago, and no one expects you to have total recall now.
I was only hoping to convey uncertainty, or the absence of certainty, if
that's all right.
Same things.
Thank you.
To the best of your recollection, having seen this document and as you told us, reviewed and commented on it, did it occur to you at the time that question 7 and the parts under question 7 that I've read to you were important matters to be communicated directly or indirectly, but efficiently at least, to frontline firefighters?
No.
Can you explain why that is?
So this inquiry by the Assembly followed a number of notable fires. I only specifically recall Colindale at the moment, but my recollection is that over a time frame of 12 or 18 months, there were 2 or 3 significant fires generated by timber-framed buildings, either complete or in construction. And so, because there had been these notable incidents, there will have been a level of knowledge at some, but maybe not all, fire stations based upon the fact of those events. So, the Colindale fire, I think, involved many stations in attendance. And it was a notable fire which which will have been considered through the kinds of processes we discussed yesterday, a PRO, a PRC, those mechanisms. So it will have received formal consideration in those terms. But I think it's likely that it was the subject of more informal discussion. So there will have been some knowledge based on the knowledge of incidents within the brigade. But in preparation for today, I've reflected hard on, at what point did we have a body of knowledge that you could rely upon in relation to numerous matters, but including the question of, for example, cladding, just when did we have enough knowledge or information or insight into, for example, the risks of cladding to, as it were, turn it into something that we needed to reflect back. And it's possible that we simply hadn't reached that stage here in 2010. My recollection is that although I'm not sure the words here are going to support what I'm going to say next, my recollection is that this was very much focused on timber-framed buildings at the time, and the risks, for example, from structural insulated panel systems didn't receive the same level of prominence or consideration. But that's only my recollection. That is only how I remember it.
Right. Let's look at, we may come back to that answer in due course, Ms. Dexter, but let's just look on, noting, if we can, at paragraph 30, as I read to you, that these were described as primary concerns from a firefighting and fire safety aspect. Looking at page 8, if we can, please, question 10 reads as follows. How have building regulations, fire safety codes and risk assessments developed over time in relation to both tall and timber-framed residential buildings? And then if we go over the page to page 9, please, as part of the answer given by the Brigade, you can see what is said. At paragraph 39 is a reference to risk assessments under the RRO, and note the exclusion there of single private dwellings or individual flats. And then at 41, questions have also risen more recently regarding, first bullet, what constitutes a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment, as suitable and sufficient is not a defined term in the fire safety order. How competency to carry out a fire risk assessment can be determined by a responsible person who's seeking to appoint a third party to carry out fire risk assessments for them. And third bullet, what constitutes a simple or complex building, and so determines whether the responsible person may be able to carry out a fire risk assessment themselves in-house or will need to appoint an expert. Can you explain, do you know why those questions had arisen? The questions identified at paragraph 41.
Those questions were still in circulation 5 years later,
Yes,
10 years later.
What had prompted them at the time?
But and I think in both cases, what prompted them was discussion outside London Fire Brigade at, for example, fire conferences. There used to be, there probably still is, an annual fire conference. And I have a distinct recollection that, for example, the Fire Protection Association were very much concerned with these questions and raising them. These questions arose out of the Brigade's experience of carrying out its fire safety regulation function. So as inspecting officers were visiting premises in London as part of their audits, they certainly came across examples of fire risk assessments which, in their view, were not suitable and sufficient.
Just to be clear, when you say the fire safety regulation function and audits, do you mean the enforcement function on the LFB in London as the enforcing body under the RRO, or the Fire Safety Order, as it's sometimes called?
I think we mean the same thing,
Yes.
but I'm not certain. So the activities undertaken by fire safety inspecting officers,
Right.
which sometimes then led to enforcement action.
Very well. Now, what had the London Fire Brigade done as at this point in time, early March 2010, to address those questions set out at paragraph 41?
Steve Turek would be able to give a much more comprehensive answer to that question. So he was the Assistant Commissioner Fire Safety, and I'm confident that Steve would be able to talk to you about, work that he and his team did with the fire industry in the broadest terms. So they were engaged with a number of bodies, professional associations. I can't bring to mind the names of them, but I recall that some of them are named in some of the exhibits to my own witness statement.
From your knowledge?
Yes, from my knowledge, in some of the reports that I produced, I repeated information about what the Fire Safety Regulation Department had been doing in terms of engagement with outside bodies. They will have been advising responsible persons that their fire risk assessments were not suitable or sufficient, for example, and in some cases will have been issuing notices of deficiency or enforcement notices or progressing to prosecution activity. So where it was appropriate, they were working with responsible persons. They were sometimes progressing that to more formal action, and they were engaged with a series of outside professional bodies and interests in order to try and make progress with these issues.
Now, I want to focus on that from the point of view of the local fire safety teams carrying out information gathering under their statutory obligations under 7.2D. Were local fire safety teams doing that exercise aware of these questions? Do you know?
I think 7.2D visits were undertaken by fire station staff in order to inform their pre-planning, and the work undertaken by fire safety inspecting officers, as it were, in auditing what was happening in premises, was a separate stream.
Indeed it was, and that's why I asked the question. Let me try it slightly differently. Were, using your expression, fire station staff conducting 7.2D visits
Yes.
and other information gathering aware of these three questions set out at paragraph 41 of this document?
I think it's much less likely that fire station staff were aware of these issues, but I wouldn't have expected them to. I would have expected the fire safety inspecting officers to be aware of them as part of their visits to premises. So they were focused differently and on different interests.
Does that tell us, let me just follow that up a little bit, does that tell us that structurally within the LFB there was a separation between the LFB's enforcement function under the RRO, or as you call it, an audit function for the purposes of ensuring that a responsible person carried out their obligations, on the one hand, and on the other, a separate body, namely local fire stations, carrying out information gathering under Section 7.2D of the 2004 Act?
Well, in structure, they were certainly separate.
Yes.
But there were arrangements for them to exchange information in a systematic way. So there were systems in place for fire safety inspecting officers to make notifications to fire stations if they'd come across something in the course of their duties which they felt might be a risk to firefighters and firefighting, and they would provide a notification to the local station to that effect, and vice versa. So there was a process of exchange, and that process of exchange was the subject of a formal report, which I think came to my Directorate Management Board. So the number of notifications in one direction to the other and vice versa was noted, together with some commentary as to the action taken as a consequence.
Within the two questions follow from that. Within the structure, as we understand it during your time, we know that fire safety regulation and enforcement sat within your directorate. Where did 72Ds, if I can use a shorthand, sit? Was that also within your directorate, or was that in the DOORT directorate?
No, in my directorate. So
right.
The carrying out of 72D visits was by firefighters based at fire stations, and in that respect it was part of the department controlled by Dave Brown, so Operations Prevention and Response.
OPR.
Yes.
Right. So that's a separate department from fire safety regulation. And second question, who oversaw the efficient flow of information between those two departments vis-à-vis what enforcing officers found in a building on the one hand and what 72D station staff found on the other? Who oversaw that process?
It probably involved more oversight than was visible to me, but as I've said, I required a report to my board which provided information about that exchange.
Right.
And I know that definitely Dave Brown had arrangements in place where he would go to the tier below him, so the Deputy Assistant Commissioners who were responsible for fire stations. So there were 4 Deputy Assistant Commissioners who each had, as it were, a portion of London, and he would take that, as it were, down the line management chain within his department in order to continue to monitor and inspire progress.
And were you always satisfied that that system, that two-way flow of information between the RRO people and the 72D people, if I can put it that way, always operated efficiently?
Yes.
So nobody ever brought to your attention, is this right, any defects in that information, any lapses in reporting of important matters, one way or the other?
No. No, they didn't. But but at the same time, I acknowledge that, for example, 72D visits. The feedback I received was that 72D visits, for example, were better undertaken in some places than others. Some crews were. There wasn't. I can't say there was a single standard for the performance of 72D visits, and the same is likely to be true for fire safety audits. But I know that both managers had arrangements in place in each of their departments to make those things better. So they were concerned that they should be as comprehensive and effective as they could be, and as we wanted them to be in compliance with policy. But it was something that they were always working at.
Just remind me, who was it, if anybody, who sat above those two departments, overseeing them and monitoring the flow of information so as to make sure that it worked one way and the other? Who was it?
Well, I sat above the departments. I don't know whether you're...
So was it you?
Yes, I think so. I was monitoring. I was receiving a report at my board which said, this number of notifications went in that direction, this number of notifications went in the other direction, and, as I say, with some commentary about what happened as a consequence.
First of all, which board are you talking about? Is that CMB?
No, I had a directorate management board, so my heads of service would meet as a board.
I see.
And the same was true in the other two directorates.
Yes. And can you just help us with what report that was? What was it called?
I can't, Mr. Millett. I know that I've been provided with a copy of one of the reports as part of the disclosure process. A year ago, I had forgotten that this process existed. It's come back to me in the last year that it did exist, and certainly as part of the disclosure process, I have been provided with a copy of at least one of those reports, but I can't tell you what specifically it was called.
No. Making allowances for your recollection, how frequently did those reports come to you? Annual?
No, more than annual. More than annual. More than annual, but I don't want to commit myself to quarterly.
You can't remember?
No.
Right. Now, let's look at the Planning and Housing Committee's final report of December 2010, which I think we looked at yesterday. That's INQ 30147111. Here you can see the title, Fire Safety in London, Fire Risks in London's Tall and Timber Frame Buildings, December 2010. If we go, please, to the recommendations about fire risk assessments on page 35, we can see recommendation 7, just below half. It says, by 2012, DCLG, in association with relevant bodies such as the local authorities, coordinators of regulatory services, LACORS, and Chief Fire Officers Association should draw up national guidance to ensure mandatory minimum standards of competence for training and accrediting fire risk assessors. Were you aware of that recommendation?
I can't say I was aware that recommendation 7 in this report from December 2010 existed, but I was aware that a number of bodies were promoting this idea.
Right. I should have asked you, did you read this report when it came? I'm assuming you did. I think we covered that yesterday.
I can't swear to it, but it's highly likely.
Right. And therefore, it's likely, would you accept, that you were aware of this recommendation?
Yes.
Yes. Do you remember whether the LFB endorsed it?
I think so. I believe that this was followed up. I know that this was followed up with a report to the then Community Safety Committee of the authority. So Steve Turrick, AC Fire Safety, produced a report which said this piece of work has happened at the London Assembly. These are the recommendations, and this is what we, the London Fire Brigade officers, believe in response to them.
Right. Now, in the recommendation, it says that the DCLG, in association with relevant bodies, and some examples are given, though, there. Do you know which the relevant bodies were, other than the LACORS and the CFOA?
No, I can't speak to that.
Did you consider that a mandatory minimum standard of competence and accreditation of fire risk assessors was by this time required, from what you could see of enforcement activity?
At this time, I don't think I had seen enough about enforcement activity to have a view. I don't believe I had a strong view about it at that time. Oh,
because this is December 2010.
Indeed.
And I thought you were getting more than annual reports about what the enforcement bodies within the LFB, the Fire Safety Department, were finding in their buildings. So was that exercise which you were overseeing not informative about standards of competence of fire risk assessors?
No, it wasn't that kind of report, Mr. Millett. I'm sorry if I've created the wrong impression. So the report to which I've referred was, as an example, a fire safety inspecting officer might undertake an audit in a high-rise residential tower block and discover that the hydrant had been vandalised. And that is an example of something where we'd want the local station to be aware of it if they weren't already, and that would be notified to the local fire station. Conversely, fire station staff doing a 72D visit, they might visit the same block on a different day and find that the corridors were cluttered, or maybe they came across examples of self-closers that either didn't work or weren't in place. They might have found holes in fire doors, and they in turn would be expected to notify that to the fire safety inspection team so that they could make a visit if necessary to form a view about, in the case of those examples, the fire safety management, for example, of the building. So that was at that level rather than at this kind of different policy level. Right.
So you, in short, you never detected from what you saw that there were any lapses in standards of fire risk assessments being carried out?
I think I did subsequently. So when I'd been in post maybe for a couple of years, I became concerned about how long it took some prosecution activity to come to fruition. I can't remember what drew it to my attention, but it came to my attention. So I might say to AC Fire Safety, maybe I was aware of a particular case and I knew that we were intending to take prosecution action. I might say to AC Fire Safety, how's that going? Why is it taking so long? And then there'd be a bit of, well, it's with the legal team. And then when I have my
I'm sorry to interrupt you. That's all very well.
Okay.
I was asking you about the quality of the fire risk assessments being carried out by responsible persons, not the speed of enforcement. So we're not...
Sorry. It was because I was concerned in some cases about the speed of enforcement that I came to set up a regular process where I met with the fire safety team, the senior team and the legal team to review every prosecution case that we had in progress. And as part of that, I would be able to see whether, for example, concerns about the quality of the fire risk assessment was one of the motivating factors in that intended prosecution. Right. So it's from that process which I established that I personally gained more insight into, for example, the question of the competency of some of the fire risk assessments.
I see. Can we then turn the page to page 36, please, and look at recommendation number 8? It says this: by 2012, DCLG should require all social landlords to publish a full register of fire risk assessments for the residential properties that they're responsible for. This will enable all residents to be informed of the findings of the relevant risk assessments, and whatever remedial action plans are in place, this register should be available online, but also available to residents in their buildings for inspection and to tenant and residents' representatives. Having read this report, I'm going to assume you were aware of this recommendation. Again, did the LFB endorse it?
From memory, AC Turek reported to the Community Safety Committee that it was a decent idea, but it had its limitations and problems.
Were you aware that this recommendation was never carried into effect?
Yes.
Do you know why it wasn't carried into effect?
No.
After the London Assembly's report was published in December 2010, did the LFB have any further involvement in implementing the report's recommendations?
A number of the recommendations were consistent with policy activities or implementation activities that we were already undertaking. So those which were directly relevant to our organisation were taken forward, as it were, as part of business as normal. I don't, from memory, think there were any recommendations with which we fundamentally disagreed. So the burden of our response to the recommendations which were relevant to our organisation were incorporated in, as it were, business as normal.
Now, I want to turn next to the Lakanal House fire. As we know, that fire took place on the 3rd of July 2009, which was before your appointment as Deputy Commissioner, and therefore, of course, before you had assumed responsibility for the Fire Safety Department. But presumably, as one of the LFB's directors, you were aware of the incident when it happened.
I was, yes.
Yes. Now, Lakanal House, as we know, is a high-rise residential block in Camberwell in South London. Do you agree that it was a significant incident for the LFB in part because of the building's compartmentation failures and the rapid fire spread?
Yes.
Let's go to LFB 401232. This is a letter dated 9th of July 2009 to the London Borough Housing Departments from Ron Dobson, the then Commissioner. And also to other housing associations and other social housing providers. As I say, it's dated the 9th of July 2009, so 6 days after the fire. And if we look at the second paragraph, you can see he says this: following the tragic fire in Camberwell on 3rd of July 2009, I consider it appropriate to personally write to you to remind you of certain matters for which you are either responsible under the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005, the order, or which you have a role in enforcing. If you look then at the third and fourth paragraphs, he says this: firstly, a requirement of the order is that a suitable and sufficient fire safety risk assessment is undertaken for all premises to which the order applies. In this regard, I'd emphasise that any risk assessment should include, amongst other things, consideration of the compartmentation within the premises, particularly where it protects means of escape routes, and that there are systems in place to ensure that these elements of compartmentation are maintained. It is also a requirement of the order that the risk assessment should be reviewed if any material change takes place within the premises. This will include changes to the compartmentation arrangements as well as potentially any refurbishment work. And the next paragraph says, the findings of the fire risk assessment must be implemented to remove or reduce fire risks and to ensure adequate general fire precautions are provided. In particular, this includes an evacuation strategy that is appropriate to the circumstances of the individual premises. It was written by Ron Dobson, the then Commissioner. Can I assume that you were aware of this letter when it went out?
I don't know that I was aware of it when it went out. I've certainly subsequently become aware of it, but I can't say I was at that time.
Right. Now, at this time, July 2009, do you know whether it was the LFB's working assumption that the cause or a cause, a root cause of the Lakanal House fire was the building's poor compartmentation?
At the time of this letter,
Yes.
No, I couldn't say that, no.
Do you know whether there was a concern within the LFB at that time that there were many other buildings in London which might suffer from similar instances of poor compartmentation?
Poor compartmentation is a really wide term. That's not a criticism of the use of it. And the Brigade routinely collects information about fires where problems with compartmentation has been an issue. So it's part of the national data recording system, and it's possible for us to extract data about that. The experience of poor compartmentation, I don't think that was a very unusual occurrence in the context of fires, but the extent of it and the reasons for it were highly variable.
Is it right that in sending this letter, and you didn't see it at the time, so perhaps we take that into account, but in sending this letter, the LFB hoped that any defects in compartmentation or maintaining compartmentation could be identified and rectified so that another incident like Lakanal House would not happen?
Yes.
Yes. Was there a view within the LFB at the time, do you know, that a stay-put policy in place for any given high-rise housing block, social or otherwise, should not be a given, but should be assessed by the responsible person on a case-by-case basis, taking into account all the fire hazards in the building and their active and passive prevention and protection measures?
No.
There wasn't.
Sorry, I hope I've understood your question correctly, but I think the answer to
It was a long question. Let me try it slightly more briefly. Was there a view within the LFB at the time that a stay-put policy in place for a given high-rise block should not be a given, but needed to be assessed by the responsible person when carrying out their obligations under the RRO?
Well, two things. At that point in time, I may not have known. So I was still Director of Corporate Services, and so there were a range of meetings and information which at that time was not available to me. So it could have been the case. I feel that the fire safety regulation people would say that was a requirement. That there is something in there are provisions in the legislation that require responsible persons to take a view about whether stay put is right for their building based on the characteristics of that building. But you would have a much better discussion about this with the Assistant Commissioner of Fire Safety Regulation. Right.
Would it be fair to say that, in short, your answer is, I don't know?
It amounts to that, doesn't it? Yes.
That's what I thought. Okay.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Now, just help me with this. If you look at the second page of this letter, please, page 2, you can see that in the last sentence it draws attention to Steve Turek, Head of Fire Safety Regulation, as the person to assist with clarifications. Do you know whether Assistant Commissioner Steve Chirrick drafted this letter or had input into it?
Oh, I think that's very likely, yes.
Now, going back to the first paragraph of the letter, if we can, please, at page 1, the introduction to the letter says this. You may recall the letter dated 23rd of March 2009 from Assistant Commissioner Steve Chirrick, in which he highlighted a number of significant fire safety issues relating to social housing. Now, that letter obviously predates Lakanal and indeed your appointment as Deputy Commissioner. But can we go to a later letter which postdates your appointment at LFB 00104291, please? This is a letter dated the 14th of December 2009 to Sir Ken Knight, the Chief Fire and Rescue Advisor to the Communities and Local Government Department of Central Government. It starts, Dear Sir Ken. It's written by Ron Dobson, and it says this. Dear Sir Ken, I'm writing to inform you that as part of our investigation into the fire at Lakanal House, Scow Gardens, Southwark, on 3rd July 2009, we've had tests carried out on the exterior wall panels of the building, and that those tests have given rise to concerns which may well be relevant to other high-rise premises. Although our investigations are continuing and the matter has still to come before the coroner, I feel that it is in the public interest to draw the issue to your attention so that the matter can be discussed within the department and any necessary advice can be given to owners and landlords of high-rise buildings. And then, if you cast your eye down the paragraphs below, the letter goes on to summarise functional requirement B4 of the building regulations, that a building's external walls should adequately resist the spread of fire, as well as the relevant provisions of approved document B. And if we go to the second page of this letter, picking it up at the third paragraph down, Mr. Dobson says, based on the tests conducted by the building research establishment, it appears that there are external wall panels at Lakanal House that do not have the necessary reaction to fire properties required for the location in which they have been used. We've also become aware that this type of panel has been supplied by more than one company. In the circumstances, we believe it may be appropriate for a warning to be given to housing providers that it would be advisable to check the specification for external wall panels in their high-rise housing stock and check that what has been installed meets the correct specification, i.e. that fire safety requirements of the building regulations were taken into account, and to include this in fire risk assessments for relevant properties. Now, I've shown you quite a bit of that letter because it's an important letter, as you can see. Was it, do you remember, drafted by the Fire Safety Department and then signed by the Commissioner?
I don't know.
Did you see it at the time before it went?
I don't believe so.
Right. Now, you had assumed, as we know, the position of Deputy Commissioner the previous month, November 2009. So you were now in charge of the Fire Safety Regulation Department, weren't you?
Yes.
Yes. But you're telling us, I think, you had no involvement in the letter's drafting or the decision to send it. Is that right?
I believe that to be the case, yes.
Right. Nonetheless, were you alive to the issues that the Commissioner was raising with Sir Ken Knight?
No.
You weren't? Right. Are you able to explain why that is?
No.
It's strange, isn't it?
Yes.
Now, we've got Sir Ken Knight's response to the Commissioner of the 22nd of December 2009 at HOM 0004618. Here it is, and it's dated the 22nd of December, as I say. Dear Ron, Lakanal House investigation, and just picking it up in the fourth paragraph down, members of CIOG did recognise, and CIOG, I should tell you, is the Strategic and Investigation Oversight Group for Lakanal House, which involved the Metropolitan Police as well. Picking it up again, members of CIOG did recognise that the information arising from the BRE report has potential implications for meeting the expectations of certain aspects of approved document B of Schedule 1 to the Building Regulations 2000 as amended, but it was felt that at this time there is insufficient information to warrant alerting housing authorities and or property owners to the specific matters raised, not least as, 1, the investigation has not yet determined if the surface spread of flame properties of the panels fitted in Lakanal House were specified by the housing authority. 2, the investigation has not yet determined if the surface spread of flame properties of the panels fitted in Lakanal House were differently specified to those subsequently fitted. Now, if you go on to the second page of this letter and look at the second paragraph and on, it says, in order to determine the evidence relating to 1 and 2 above, the MPS investigators are actively pursuing the information required to clarify the public interest issues. The above matters have been discussed with colleagues within communities and local government. The clarification being sought by the investigators will in turn assist further discussion on the disclosure of the relevant information. In the meantime, CLG housing policy colleagues are including a generic statement in a letter to housing authorities, a copy of which I will forward to you. I look forward to keeping in touch on the above issues. Now, we have a copy of CLG's letter to housing authorities which contained that generic statement, Ms Dexter, and I'll show you that. LFB 30/41215. And you can see from the letter now on the screen that it is also dated the 22nd of December 2009, the very same day as Sir Ken Knight's letter to Commissioner Dobson, and it's addressed to the chief executives of local housing authorities in England, and it's entitled Fire Safety in High-Rise Social Rented Housing Blocks. And if you look at the first page, under the heading Building Regulations and Building Control, it says this: one point of interest coming to our attention has been concerns raised regarding the specification of window and cladding systems used on high-rise blocks. Guidance on the appropriate specification of external walls and cladding systems to satisfy the fire safety aspects of building regulations is given in approved document B, Fire Safety, section 12. Then there's a footnote which takes you to it. Whilst the specification of window frames would not normally be affected by this guidance, infills, spandrels and overcladding could be. Where any work which is subject to the building regulations is carried out, then this should be checked by a building control body, BCB, in accordance with those regulations. If there's any doubt over the application of or compliance with these regulations, then advice should be sought from the relevant BCB. Now, there are some questions which are coming. I just want to show you one more document. LFB 30/89549. This is an email. If we go to the bottom half of the page, you can see that there's an email by which this letter, the generic letter from the DCLG, was sent to Commissioner Dobson. You can see Kelly Fairman at CLG, on behalf of Ken Knight, sends it on the 23rd of December. You see that? Mm-hmm. And there's some text below it. If we go up the page, we can see that Ron Dobson sends it on to you, Steve Turek, Tim Cutbill and John Bradbury with the remark, "This is interesting." Do you remember, what did you understand the Commissioner to mean by "this is interesting"?
I'm sorry, would you mind going further down the page again just so I can try and answer that question?
Yes, of course.
I don't think I can shed any light on the "this is interesting" comment.
Did you have a view at the time yourself of the CLG's letter, the generic letter I've just looked at with you?
I can't recall having one, no.
Do you remember whether you considered it an adequate response to the concerns raised by the Brigade's letter, Commissioner Dobson's letter?
I'm not certain I saw Commissioner Dobson's letter, as I said a few minutes ago. So I'm not certain I saw that letter, and during preparation for today, I have seen it, and I have asked for a review to see whether I was ever copied in to it, and I haven't had any confirmation that I was. So I absolutely don't recall the letter.
Right. I mean, can you think of a reason why Ron Dobson would have sent that letter without copying you in on it, or at least telling you about it?
Yes, I can think of a reason, which is that he worked very closely with the fire investigation team, our fire investigation team, that investigated the Lakanal House fire. And as I'm sure you know, he'd established the Lakanal House board, i.e. the officer group, which I joined in February, I think at the same time as Dave Brown. Now, I don't know why I wasn't there for the first 3 or 4 meetings. I don't know even that I knew that they were happening. So I did only join the Lakanal House board in February, I think February 2010. But if you asked me a question about the reason, and my view of that is because he was working closely with the fire investigation team and they were feeding back to him preliminary results. But my recollection is that the final report of the fire investigation team in terms of the Lakanal House fire didn't finally emerge for a considerable period after. It may have been more than a year, for example. I'm not certain. But my guess would be that it was a preliminary finding which he was aware of based on his close work with the fire investigation team.
Just will you remind me, you may have told me already, and I apologise if I've asked this question before, but where did the fire investigation team fit in the structure of the LFB at the time?
In the Fire Safety Regulation Department.
It sat in the Fire Safety Regulation Department, and therefore at this time it was one of the departments sitting within your directorate.
It was, and I understand the, it was. I would simply add that as Commissioner, Ron Dobson took a very intense interest in the Lakanal House fire in particular. So he was very involved in that incident, which actually, in a way that I think probably was unusual for a chief fire officer, or for our chief fire officer, because he thought it was important. If I reflect back on the Bethnal Green fire, for example, in 2004, the way the lessons from that were taken forward, and that was a very significant fire for London Fire Brigade, involved a degree of delegation. But in relation to the Lakanal House fire, Ron was always very hands-on in how it was taken forward and many of the key decisions.
Yes, but you had come into the position of...
Yes.
Well, let me just ask the question. As we've established, you'd come into the position of Deputy Commissioner the previous month. Is it fair to say that the Lakanal House fire and Mr Dobson's involvement is something that he would have wanted you to be closely involved with as his immediate deputy and as the director in charge of the Fire Safety Regulation Department?
Yes, and I think that happened subsequently. So you know, for example, that he recommended to the authority that the Operational Directorates Coordination Board should oversee the continuing implementation of the Rule 43 Action Plan. That wasn't until 2013, but ODCB had already started before that recommendation to the authority. So I don't doubt his intention to involve me, but it didn't start immediately.
Right. Do you remember discuss this letter, the generic letter, with Steve Turek?
I don't remember doing so, no.
Any other fire safety colleagues?
No, I don't think so.
What about Tim Cutbill?
Definitely not. No, I don't think so. It was a long time ago, 2009. I don't think so.
Did you, or to your knowledge, anybody else consider pressing this issue further with the CLG or with Sir Ken?
I don't know.
Am I right in thinking that the DCLG had not taken up the LFB's suggestion of writing to housing providers to request specifically that they proactively check the specification of their high-rise external wall panels for compliance with the building regulations?
Mr Miller, I only know what I've read there, and it doesn't appear so.
Right. does it follow that it remained the case, and the LFB knew that it remained the case, that any number of high-rise buildings in London could well have non-compliant panels that promoted fire spread?
Yes.
Yes. And therefore, it remained the case that a fire like Lakanal House could occur in any number of high-rise buildings in London at any time. All these fires, in my experience, all these fires had different characteristics. If I made a list of 10 things that might have been features of the Lakanal House fire, and I worked through other high-rise fires in London, either that had happened or could happen, I might tick 4 of those items, I might tick 9 of those items. All fires are different. And so the potential is there, but, especially after Grenfell, there are few potentialities that we exclude as being possible these days. But I don't think it would be right to say, based on this fire, the same fire could happen in the Mirror block, for example. It certainly could, but it would be speculative rather than us saying, based upon what we know about the fire safety features of that building, it's inevitable. But in light of your earlier answers, do you remember a time whether you or anybody in the fire safety department considered telling station staff that this risk existed and that therefore they needed to check with the building owner whether the external wall complied with the building regulations, given that this risk was one which had been identified with government but not taken up by way of communication to housing providers?
No. I think it's more complicated than that question and my answer, but the answer to your question is no.
And can you give us a reason why the answer is no?
I'm sorry, Mr. Millett, would you ask the question again?
Yes. Did anybody, to your knowledge, in the fire safety department consider telling station staff that there was a risk that cladding systems did not comply with the building regulations, and that was something they should verify with the building owners on their 72D visits, or indeed as part of RRO enforcement?
Okay. So the answer is still no, to the best of my knowledge. We would have had to have given... sorry, this isn't intended as an excuse, but you've asked me why the answer is no. I'm not sure about the extent of our knowledge about cladding at that point in time. And it's not my understanding then or now that all cladding is bad and inevitably a risk. Presumably, there are buildings that are clad where the cladding does what it's supposed to do and doesn't do what it's not supposed to do. But, the cladding might be good, but its combination with something else might be bad, and that makes it a risk, or its nature of fixing might be bad. And so so it's more complicated. Sorry, my answer is no, we didn't. But I think I'm not sure about the depth of the information we had. And I think the whole topic of cladding is more complicated than cladding is bad and is a risk.
That may be so, but reducing it to its minimum, you accept, because we see it from the Commissioner's letter, that a warning should be given to housing providers because of a risk that the specifications for the external wall panels that they had used on their high-rise blocks might be non-compliant.
Yes, I accept that. That's a very fair point. And I also accept, Mr. Millett, that fire safety regulation and operations may not have been closely integrated in fire brigades in the way they should have been over a long period. They were, I think in all brigades, structurally separate, one from the other. And I think that over time, the extent to which the knowledge and experience of the fire safety people, as it were, fire investigators, fire engineers, that has spread into operations has improved. It's changed and improved. And I would say that was my experience based on my London experience. And I don't know what, you have an expert on fire brigades, and, I'd be interested to know what he thinks about that, whether, maybe they have been separate universes for a long time, but I think that is much less so these days.
Now let's turn to your involvement on the Lakanal House board. We touched on that body earlier on. And if we go to your witness statement, please, LFB 3032363 at page 3, paragraph 8. Underneath the heading Lakanal House Board, it says this: the Lakanal House Board, the board, began meeting on 1st October 2009. The board was directed and usually chaired by the Commissioner, Ron Dobson. I became a member at the 5th meeting on 22nd of February 2010, which I chaired in the absence of the Commissioner. And that's something I think you've already told us. It's right, isn't it, that before the inquests, or rather before the inquest hearings, which ran from January to March 2013, the Lakanal House Board identified a number of lessons learned and organisational action points from the fire?
Yes.
Yes. Now, I think we first see those actions in the minutes of the Lakanal House Board meeting for the 15th of September 2010. Let's go to that. It's at LFB 3055192. And we can see from the first page what the membership is. Other than the Commissioner, you are one of the members there. You see that?
Yes.
As the Deputy Commissioner. But you can see the attendees at the meeting.
Yes.
And you, it appears from that, were absent. I think that's right, isn't it? Because you sent apologies.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, nonetheless, can we take it that you would have read
Yes.
this meeting note or minute after the meeting?
Yes.
It would have been sent to you. Yes. Can we go to page 7, please? And on page 7, you can see Appendix 1 action plan. And there is a list of actions which goes over the page for 2 more pages. Can you just confirm that these actions came to be known as the Lakanal pre-actions by virtue of their having preceded the Lakanal inquest?
They were never referred to in those terms. I think this. Are there 34 items in this list?
There are.
It became known as the Lakanal House Action Plan.
Yes, I see, right. And indeed, as you've correctly pointed out, there are 34 actions in total. Do you know how the board, the Lakanal House Board, went about identifying each of those action points?
How did it go about it? Well, following the fire, there will have been debriefs, as it were, about different aspects of the fire. So I'm it was before my time, as it were, but with a fire of this seriousness, the Commissioner would have and did bring together all of those senior officers whom he thought had something significant to say at an early stage about aspects of the incident. So that might be the operational response, it might be control performance, it might be fire investigation. And over and above that, he appointed, you've already referred to somebody called Tim Cutbill, he appointed Tim Cutbill to lead, I can't remember what the team was called, but a team was established to work specifically on the Lakanal House fire and the follow-up, in the same way as I'm sure the inquiry have seen in relation to Grenfell. So the Grenfell process, I think it has been modelled very much on what happened after Lakanal. So a senior officer was appointed to lead a team of people who worked with heads of service, either in meetings with the Commissioner and or others, or outside those meetings, to identify what, at that time, on the face of it, seemed to be the priority issues for the Brigade to address.
That's the structural answer to the question.
Okay.
Do you know what the methodological answer to the question is? In other words, what tools did that team use to go about identifying the action points? Do you know?
I don't think there were any tools as such, but I can see, looking even at what's on the screen now, so if I look at item 3, complete an operational sequential time event plot, that will be the same type of activity or the same nature of activity as was undertaken after, for example, 7/7. So after 7/7, which was a very significant incident, there were processes for, as it were, plotting, as said here, the response of the brigade. What time were calls received, what response was made, what was mobilised, when did they get there, what equipment did they use. And so some of these actions will be based on the experience of analysis and investigation of previous very significant incidents in London.
Right. Now, a number of the actions were attributed to departments within your directorate, weren't they?
They were.
For example, if we scroll down to page 8, we can see item 20, review of high-rise fires where fire spread beyond the compartment. Yes?
Yep.
ACFSR, fire safety regulation. Is it right that the Fire Safety Regulation Department was also heavily involved in the ongoing police investigation into the cause of the Lakanal House fire?
The fire safety investigation, did you say?
No, the police.
Oh, the fire safety department.
Yes.
Yes, but also the team to which I've referred that was headed by Tim Cutbill.
Yeah, indeed. So
who weren't part of the fire safety department.
Right. So both the Lakanal House. Is this right that as a result, both the Lakanal House Board and the Fire Safety Regulation Department, under your stewardship, were involved in and very familiar with the LFB's response to the Lakanal House fire?
Yes, yes, but not response. Operations, prevention, and response were also intimately involved in the response to the fire. So Dave Brown was responsible for control, for example, mobilising and control, and so he had, as it were, an equivalent interest to the fire investigation team's interest in cause and origin.
Yes, but that department, operations, prevention and response, also sat within your directorate.
Yes.
Now, I just want to look at some correspondence with the DCLG about requirement B4. It's a slightly different topic, but chronologically it's pre-inquest. Mr. Chairman, that's a good time to take the break, I think.
Well, I did wonder whether it might be, so good. Ms. Dexter, we're going to have a break now. We'll resume, please, at 11:30. And as before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room. Thank you. Thank you. 11:30, please. Would you ask Mrs. Dexter to come back in, please? Yeah. All right, Mrs. Dexter.
Thank you.
Carry on. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ms. Dexter, we're now going to look, as I say, at correspondence with the DCLG over the question of requirement B4 of the building regulations, which is external fire spread. Can we start, please, with LFB 3039547? Now, this is a minute of 15th of October 2010 of a meeting of the Lakanal investigation team. And you can see from the list of those present that you were not there, but LFB representatives were there, and we can see Peter Mancy, Andy Jack, Tim Cutbill, Nick Carey and David Kennett. And there were others there from the Metropolitan Police Service, the HSE and the BRE, as you can see, Dave Crowder, and Richard Chitty. Looking at the individuals from the LFB, did any of those work within your directorate? I think we know that Andy Jack did. What about Peter Mancy and Nick Carey?
Yes.
They did?
Yes.
And Tim Cutbill, you told us, did?
No,
David,
no, he didn't.
He didn't?
No, he... for the purposes of Lakanal, he was... a team was created, which he headed, and insofar as it was in a directorate, it would have been in Gary's rather than mine.
Right. But I see. So I think he worked in operational resilience at the time, did he?
Okay. Yes, but I think he was probably seconded out.
Yes, I follow.
Yeah.
I follow. Now, if you look at the second page of this document, 3 paragraphs from the bottom of the page, you'll see the following exchange. RM, and that's, I think, DI Rick Murphy, initiates extensive discussion about areas requiring clarification regarding the contract between LBS and Apollo, which also leads to discussions about building regs and building control approval. DK, that's David Kennett, comments that Adrian Prest may be able to provide expert guidance on matters relating to building regs and building control. AJ, that's Andy Jack, refers to Brian Martin and a document that specifies that responsibility for building works rests with the builder. Action. And then if we can go over the page, RM, that's Rick Murphy again, of the Metropolitan Police, suggests a meeting with Adrian Prest and the contract lawyer in order to clarify areas relating to the contract, building control and building regs. Were you aware of David Kennett's suggestion to seek Adrian Prest's expert guidance on the building regulations?
No.
You weren't. Can we then go to LFB 3082587? Let's follow this through and see how much you can help us with it. If you go to this email run, it's in October 2010, as you can see from what's on the page. And if you go to the email at the foot of the page, from Adrian Prest to Mark Fiskin, 18th of October 2010, subject LFIPA questions. Now, Mark Fiskin, I think we've established, was in LFB's legal department. Is that right?
Now you've said that, yes, I remember that.
Yes, I mean, I think fell within your directorate too,
Yes.
didn't it? Yes.
Yes.
Now, this is 3 days after the investigation team meeting that the minutes for which we've just looked at. And he says, further to Friday's telephone conversation with your fire officer colleagues, for clarification, the points discussed are summarised in the attached document, which perhaps you could forward on to them. And if we look at the attachment, it's at LFB 3039545. And it's entitled LFIPA Questions, October 2010, Rebuilding Regulations and Refurbishment Works. You see that?
Yes.
Just looking at this document, I can show you more if you like. Do you think you saw this at the time?
I don't think so, no.
You don't think so? And were you informed of the contents at the time, do you think?
I don't think so.
Right. Can we go to page 5 then and see how we get on? Page 5 has questions 4 and 15, October discussions. I think that means 4th and 15th of October. Discussions B4, external walls, fire spread. Now, I'll just go through this with you, see how much you can help us with it. The question, do the requirements for external walls bear directly upon their ability to resist fire spreading from inside a building and up the outside of the wall, i.e. when ignited, other than by radiation from another building? See that?
Yes.
And then Mr. Prest goes on to summarise his understanding of Regulation B4. For example, in the third paragraph on this page, he says, ADB4, it's approved document B4, as amended in March 2010, performance states that B4 will be met if the external walls restrict the risk of ignition from an external source and the spread of fire over their surfaces, so as to limit the risk of a fire spreading from the building to a building beyond the boundary. This indicates that the concern is in relation to the transmission of fire to other buildings rather than the spread of fire along the walls to other parts of the existing fire-affected building. And then if you look at the penultimate paragraph on that page under conclusions, Adrian Prest's ultimate conclusion was, and I'll read it, he says, although there are requirements relating to fire spread, including in cavities of external walls, ADB does not clearly indicate that resistance or prevention of fire spread over external walls from an internal fire is an objective in its own right. That was his advice, and he signs it off, as you can see, just below that. Then if we go back to the covering email at LFB 3082587, please, we can see what happens to the advice. If you look at the second email down, Mark Fiskin sends it to David Kennett, also on the 18th of October 2010, FYI, and then that then gets forwarded on to Andy, he sends it to David Kennett and Andy Jack. And then at the email at the top of the page, 21st of October, David Kennett sends it to Paul Jenkins, copied to Andy Jack and Mark Fiskin. And he says, Paul, don't know if Andy has talked to you about our advice from Adrian Prest, but can you have a look at the attached document? Adrian's understanding of B4 is at odds with R and somewhat cuts across all the discussions we've had over the last year regarding vertical fire spread. It may be that we need to ask Adrian to come down to us for a meeting to discuss further. Catch up with you next week. Now, first, Paul Jenkins, as far as we are concerned, he worked as a group manager in fire engineering. Is that right, or can you help? Who was he?
I can't swear to it being fire engineering, but certainly he was a group manager within the Fire Safety Regulation Department.
Thank you. Is it right to say, from your knowledge at the time, that Adrian Prest's understanding of B4 was indeed at odds with the LFB's interpretation? As far as you understood it.
I don't believe I had any understanding of these issues at the time. I've read about them subsequently. I don't quite understand how Mr. Prest, Adrian Prest, fits into the equation, but my knowledge about these issues is more contemporary. It certainly doesn't date to 2010.
I see. Right. So when David Kennett refers to all the discussions we've had over the last year regarding vertical fire spread, would it follow you're not able to help us with what those discussions were or how they originated?
No.
You're not. Let's see how this goes further. If you go to LFB 3049525, we find a minute of a meeting in January 2011, 18th of January 2011, entitled Lakanal House Notes of Meeting held on 18th January 2011. And you can see who was present: Andy Jack, Paul Jenkins and Dave Kennett, with John Bradbury in the chair. Apologies from Steve Turek, as you can see at the start. And then if we go to page 2, the minutes record this. It's paragraph 3.7, but the paragraph numbers become adrift. And the paragraph starts, Dave Kennett advised. Can you see that?
Yes.
Just below it. Dave Kennett advised that he and Group Manager Paul Jenkins would be meeting Brian Martin to discuss B4 fire spread issues, and Adrian Prest's view that the external part of the Lakanal building complies with the building regulations. If there is ultimately any concern over the interpretation of ADB, then this would be a national learning issue, and it would be for the Commissioner to raise with the Secretary of State. First, can you help us? What was the LFB's connection with Brian Martin?
Brian Martin, I don't believe I ever personally met or corresponded with Brian Martin, but I believe he was the DCLG official responsible for building control.
Yes, and do you know what the nature of the relationship was, if any, or connection was between the LFB and Brian Martin?
In the course of normal business in local government, including in London Fire Brigade, officials of an authority would from time to time have discussions with the sponsoring department official who had policy responsibility for the thing they were interested in.
Now, obviously, you were not at the meeting. Did you see this note?
I don't believe so, no.
Right. I see. So you weren't involved in these discussions at all?
Not at all.
Right. I see. Can we look at LFB 304958, which is the minute of the subsequent meeting on the 1st of February 2011? As we can see, Steve Turek was there. Same, the other individuals were the same other than Paul Jenkins. And if we go to page 1 at the bottom, we have to scroll down to look at 3, enforcement. 3.1, Dave Kennett reported that he, Andy Jack, GM Paul Jenkins and police representatives had met with Brian Martin to discuss the issues raised by Adrian Prest. Brian Martin did not concur with Adrian Prest's views on external fire spread and the building regulations and suggested that LFB write to him rather than the Secretary of State with a series of questions to get a formal view. Dave Kennett has produced the questions that have been agreed by all relevant parties. He will now draft the letter for ACDAC FSR approval. At that stage, early February 2011, were you aware at all of Fire Safety's intention to write to the government, Brian Martin?
No.
And I'm assuming, therefore, you were not involved in the letter, signing it off?
I don't believe so.
Right. Do you know whether that would have been something that Commissioner Dobson was involved in?
I don't know whether he was or he wasn't, but Assistant Commissioner Turek had sufficient authority to be pursuing this important fine detail with Brian Martin without, as it were, without having to check it with either me or with Ron Dobson.
I follow. Let's then take this as quickly as we can, given your lack of involvement. Can we go? Well, as a fact, I'll just give a reference. Andy Jack did write to Brian Martin, and if we look at LFB 20120305, I say Andy Jack wrote, he was involved in the decision to write. Let me just show you the letter. Here it is. It's dated the 14th of February 2011, and it's signed by Steve Turek to Brian Martin, who's the Principal Construction Professional, Sustainable Buildings Division at the DCLG. And I'll just show you what it says. He says, "Dear Mr. Martin, you'll be aware that we're currently carrying out an investigation into the fire that occurred at Lakanal. As part of the investigation, we need to ensure that we have correctly understood requirement B4 of the building regulations, particularly with regards to vertical fire spread. Therefore, we seek your assistance and would be grateful if you would answer the questions set out below. Requirement B4.1 contains 2 objectives. Firstly, to restrict the spread of fire over the external envelope of the building, and secondly, to restrict the spread of fire from one building to another. And then question 1, please confirm whether or not the first objective is an objective in its own right, regardless of distance from any boundary. 2, please confirm whether or not building regulations and approved document B recognises that rapid fire spread over the external envelope of a building may make fire service intervention more difficult, and therefore the combustibility of the external envelope should be controlled." And the other 3 questions are also important, but perhaps not for you. They're about the provisions of approved document B in relation to buildings over 18 metres. including the reference to Class 0 in question 4. Now, this letter on its face would suggest that as of February 2011, the LFB's Fire Safety Department had developed a very detailed, technical and nuanced understanding of external wall panels, insulation, the combustibility of those materials and the risk present in the built environment. But would you agree with that proposition?
Yes.
Yes. They had also well grasped the difference between reaction to fire and resistance to fire. So, can you answer that, or perhaps you?
I don't think I can.
One way or the
No.
other? All right.
No.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, just pausing there. This is a letter which asks 5 questions of government. Was the fact that those questions were asked of government something that the Lakanal board was kept abreast of?
I don't know.
You don't know one way or the other, or I mean.
I simply don't recall.
Right.
I think it's likely that at the Lakanal board, Steve Turek or Tim Cutbill reported that there were discussions with DCLG, but because I think in the natural course of events, that's the kind of thing they would have reported, but I'm not certain.
Right. Now let's look at Brian Martin's reply to the letter, 23rd of February 2011. It's only a week or so later. LFB 00113254. And if we look at the final 3 paragraphs on that page, he responds and says in the last paragraph, the 2 objectives that form the requirements in paragraph B41 of Schedule 1 of the building regulations are closely linked, but are independent of each other. Both need to be considered having regard to the height, use and position of the building. So in short, it looks as if he confirmed the LFB's view, the Andy Jack, Dave Kennett view, and that Adrian Prest's interpretation of requirement B4 was wrong. We can get that from the documents. My question for you is, do you know whether the LFB was satisfied with that response?
I don't know.
So you don't know whether there was any follow-up?
No.
Now, given that the LFB's, as it appears, go-to authority on the fire and rescue services, Adrian Prest, was revealed, it appears to have misunderstood the meaning and effect of functional requirement B4. Do you know whether the LFB, or the Fire Safety Department, or anybody within the LFB took steps to warn operational crews of the consequent risk to them or their operations of fire spread over the surface of the external wall?
The answer is I don't know. I don't know if I also don't know whether if I reviewed operational news, I would discover that such references exist, which may not be a product of this specifically or Lakanal specifically. So the answer to your question is I don't know, but it doesn't mean it's definitely not there.
Right.
I'm sorry, I don't know who Adrian Prest is. I've read this, and you describe him as our go-to authority. I'm just not quite sure about that.
No, well, I understand that. And
yeah, okay.
But because of your inability to help us, I haven't explained why I put that to you. But you can't help on that either. Would it also follow that nobody in the LFB took steps to tell station staff that on their information gathering, or in their information gathering under Section 72D, they needed to be looking closely at the risks inherent in fire spread over the surface of the external wall?
I think that's true at this point in time. I simply can't bring to mind what happens subsequently in terms of guidance for 72D visits, but I'm not sure that would have fallen within the scope of a 72D visit, but you ought to talk to Dave Brown on that topic.
Right. Can I ask you why you're not sure that would fall within the scope of a 72D visit, as you call it?
again, I think David Brown will be a much better authority than I can be on this. But I think 72D visits were more focused on the characteristics of a building, broadly determined, rather than, I mean, the point about understanding or knowing what the characteristics of the building were was to inform pre-planning and firefighting. So I'm not saying it's a completely separate thing, but I'm not sure what claims could reliably be made about whether 72D visits were intended and did consider, for example, fire development. If they said, if they discovered as part of a 72D visit that a building was clad, that's the thing that would be recorded. That's something that would appear then on the MDT, and in the circumstances of the incident, that would obviously be something to which they'd have regard. But it was a consequence of the 72D rather than a feature of the 72D, I feel, based on my understanding of 72D visits. But David Brown will be a much better authority on this.
Just from your perspective at the time, did you have any understanding or views about whether station staff gathering information under Section 72D should be looking or needn't look at the external wall of a high-rise building and the risks posed by it?
No, I didn't.
Right. Now, can I then look with you at Commissioner Dobson's witness statement to the inquiry? This is at LFB 3032157, because the history goes on, and I just want to show this to you and see if you can help. If we go to page 5 of that witness statement, paragraph 16, he says this. During the time of the Lakanal House board, on the 11th of December 2012, I wrote to Brandon Lewis MP, Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, responsible for fire. A copy of this letter is produced at Exhibit RJD4. The letter accurately reflects those issues arising from the Lakanal House fire that the LFB considered to be beyond the control of LFB and therefore warranted consideration by the government. And he goes on to say, I received a response from Miss Upton from the DCLG on the 6th of February 2013. We'll come to that. Now, the letter that he's exhibiting of 11th of December 2012 is at LFB 3032154. Can we please turn that up? Now, the date's important. As you can see, 11th December 2012. This is very shortly before the opening of the inquests for Lakanal House in the next month. And some time after the establishment of the Lakanal House board, just putting it in its chronological context. And he says this, Dear Minister, you will be aware that the London Fire Brigade has been carrying out an investigation into the fire that occurred at Lakanal, Camberwell on the 3rd of July 2009. In the course of that investigation, a number of issues have come to light that may warrant consideration by your department. The issues have been set out below as a number of recommendations. Appendix 1, which is attached to this letter, provides background information for each recommendation. Now, just pausing there, do you know who drafted that letter?
I don't know, no. I could speculate that it was Tim Cutbill because he was still leading the team.
Right. We know that Andy Jack contributed to it because he's told us that in one of his statements. Yep. But you can't help us with the drafting. Did you see the letter before it went to Mr. Lewis?
I can't remember.
You can't remember. Moving down the page, you can see that there's a set of recommendations. Recommendation 1 reads as follows, that government provide further guidance regarding A, which parts and areas of buildings containing multiple domestic premises can be described as parts used in common, common parts, and B, how the fire safety order is intended to operate in relation to these premises where the responsible person does not necessarily have control over features affecting common parts and or common fire precautions. Do you know what aspect of the Lakanal House fire and the LFB's subsequent investigation into the cause of that fire prompted the LFB to identify that as an issue regarding requiring additional guidance and government action?
I feel it's doors and or door frames, but I'm not certain.
Right. You feel it's that. Is that something from your recollection at the time, or is that just from reading in preparation to give evidence?
I think I'm reaching back to my recollection, and that's what I think I recall, but I'm certainly not certain,
Right.
Mr. Millett.
Let's look at recommendation number 5 at the foot of the page, that government provide further guidance in relation to requirement B4 of the building regulations, particularly with regards to the spread of fire over the external envelope of the building. Now, there's further background to that recommendation in the annex or appendix to the letter. We find at LFB 3032154. Now, there's quite a lot in this which I should show you, but again, you may not be able to help, and let's see if you can. If we look at the text of recommendation 5, this is on page 6 of this document. There's the recommendation in bold. You can see Part B of Schedule 1 of the building regulations set out. And then it says, Regulation B4 seeks to control 2 aspects of building works with regard to fire spread. Where the regulation is complied with, this should ensure that fire cannot easily spread from one building to another, and the rate of fire spread over the external face of the building is controlled. The building regulations recognises that a fire spreading over the external envelope of a building is undesirable for 2 reasons and should be controlled. Firstly, the fire may spread so rapidly that it is a risk to the health and safety of occupants. Secondly, such a fire, particularly in tall buildings, has the potential to affect multiple stories simultaneously, thus making firefighting more difficult. The regulations accept that fire spread from one floor to another via the external windows cannot be eliminated, but the rate of fire spread should not be at a speed that prevents occupants from the building escaping or makes fire service intervention unusually difficult. To address this matter, approved document B makes recommendations regarding the combustibility of materials that are used on the exterior face of the building. The guidance is more onerous for buildings that are over 18 metres in height. The investigation has highlighted that the intentions of the building regulations with regards to restricting the spread of fire over the external face of the building may not be fully understood. We do not think that approved document B is particularly clear on this matter. Additionally, there are a number of recognised publications that provide guidance and commentary on the building regulations, namely Guide to Part B of the Building Regulations 2006, edition by Fire Safety Engineering Consultants Limited, Guide to the Building Regulations 2011 edition by Hugh Evans, and the Building Regulations Explained and Illustrated 12th edition. Other than repeating the recommendations that are contained within approved document B, they do not explain or comment on the requirement to restrict the spread of fire over the external envelope of the building. Our view that the requirement to restrict the spread of fire over the external envelope of the building is an objective in its own right, regardless of the distance from any boundary, has been confirmed by Department of Communities and Local Government. Now, did you, I've read a lot of that to you, did you have any understanding or view of what I've just read to you there at the time?
Yes, I'll have sat at my desk and read it more slowly than you've just read it to me, but yes.
But you would have understood, would you, at the time, that the concerns, the issues, the problems identified in what I've just read to you were problems or issues faced by the LFB in London from the built environment?
That they were problems manifest certainly in this incident. I simply wouldn't have known the extent to which they were wider spread than that.
Do you know whether the LFB had taken any steps or undertaken any work on this issue between receiving the response from Brian Martin on the 23rd of February 2011 and the date of this letter in December 2012.
I'm sorry, ask me that again.
Well, this is December 2012.
Indeed.
Do you know whether the LFB had undertaken any work or further investigation into the problems that we now see set out in this letter between the date of Brian Martin's letter on the 23rd of February 2011 and the date of this letter in December 2012? Almost 2 years.
I think you ought to talk to Gary Reason and or Peter Cowart about this, because I'm not certain that this clarification about the building regulations required a new or discrete response. I am not certain, because I'm not a firefighter, that you will not. I'm not certain that that because you don't see it in a linear relationship with this correspondence, that the issue was not covered. So it's certainly possible that existing policies of the London Fire Brigade, for example, the high-rise firefighting policy or the dynamic risk, the decision-making model, dynamic risk assessment, it's certainly at least possible, if not likely, that those policies were intended already to be responsive to these issues about the potential for fire spread. So this is addressing, a clearly very important point about understanding of the building regulations, but I'm not sure that translated into a requirement for a very specific intervention that was not already, as it were, dealt with in existing brigade policies. So that if I was to ask a question about that, that is the question that I would have put to Gary Reason and or Peter Cowart. To what extent is this risk already covered off by what we already have in place?
Did you ask that question?
I don't think I did, Mr. Millett, no.
Why
no.
is that?
It clearly didn't occur to me to ask that question. But you can't take from that others in London Fire Brigade had not taken a view on it, and but I didn't.
Right.
No.
So, but I think my question was what had happened between February 11 and December 12 to develop the thinking on this, and I don't think you can help. Or can you?
Well, I can only say I can only repeat that. That I can't speak for Peter Cowart or Gary Reason, and it is possible that with their specific responsibilities, they had given consideration to whether a new piece of work, as it were, or a new intervention was required in order for this to be more prominent within the operational workforce.
But this letter was something going to government.
Yes.
I would have assumed that as a member of the Lakanal House board and as a senior person within the LFB, you would have seen this letter.
I think it's likely that I did, yes.
And therefore, it wouldn't have come to you out of the blue after 22 months of silence. So my question is, what happened between February 2011, when the government answered Commissioner Dobson's questions first time round, and December 2012 to develop the thinking?
Sorry, what happened between February?
Between February 2011, 23rd of February 2011, when the dclg, Brian Martin, responded to Commissioner Dobson's questions, and the 11th of December 2012, when these recommendations were set out. I just want to know what happened in that 20-month or 22-month period. Can you help?
Sorry, my recollection is that Brian Martin was in discussion with the fire safety regulation team rather than with Ron Dobson in 2011. I hope I've not confused that. And I can't help you with. I personally can't help you with it, but
right.
but I wouldn't take it for granted that others couldn't.
No, I wasn't asking you.
Indeed.
Others. You can't help us, you
No,
can't help us.
I can't.
Can you help us with this? Do you know what the LFB was hoping for in making recommendation number 5?
May I see it again, please?
Of course, I'm so sorry. Could we go back to page 1? Foot of page 1. Further guidance.
They were hoping to achieve further clarity. We were hoping to achieve further clarity.
Well, clearly, but was it simply clarity that B4 had 2 discrete parts, or was it further than that?
I don't know.
Right. If we go to page 2, we look at recommendation 7, and that says that government provide guidance for the responsible person as to how they might assess that the risk assessor has sufficient training, experience and knowledge to carry out a suitable assessment of the risk in complex and high-risk premises. And again, we have further background to that in Appendix 1 at page 7. We can go to page 7. There's the recommendation again in bold and at the foot of the page. Note, this issue was identified early on in the investigation. Since then, the Fire Risk Assessment Competency Council has been established. Although the council is in its infancy, it seems likely that it will address the issues raised in recommendation 7. However, recommendation 7 has been included for completeness. Do you know what it was about the Lakanal fire or the LFB's subsequent investigations that gave rise to this concern and the recommendation?
Do I know? I know some things about the topic of the fire risk assessments that Southwark had undertaken in their stock prior to Lakanal and the Brigade's involvement in that, but I don't know how close that gets to your question.
Did the LFB have any involvement in the council's work? The Fire Risk Assessment Competency Council's work?
I don't know.
Right. Can we go to LFB 3032153? We see here the DCLG's reply to Commissioner Dobson's letter. It's dated the 6th of February 2013, and it's from Louise Upton of the DCLG. Now, just for your information, her letter contained no response to recommendation 7, which we've just looked at, but she did address recommendation 1, and that's on the 3rd paragraph of this page. And she says this: in terms of recommendation 1 and 2, we've considered previously the extent to which the regulatory reform Fire Safety Order 2005, which gives effect to a number of European Council directives designed to improve safety and health of workers at work, was intended to apply to premises or parts of premises other than those which could be viewed as workplaces or places to which the public have access. As you know, the order specifically does not apply to domestic premises except to the extent mentioned in Article 3110. And then looking ahead to page 3, if we just do that, and come back to page 1 in a moment, we can see Louise Upton's response on recommendation 5, namely the need for further guidance in relation to functional requirement B4. And she says, on recommendation 5, requirement B4 of the building regulations and its supporting guidance explicitly state that external walls should adequately resist the spread of fire over the walls and, underlined, from one building to another. Further guidance is given in the BRE publication BRE 135, Fire Performance of External Thermal Insulation for Walls of Multi-Storey Buildings, which explains the objectives for controlling fire spread on the external envelope of tall buildings in detail. Now, I've shown you a little bit of the letter. Do you remember seeing it at the time?
I think so, yes.
Do you remember how you yourself reacted to seeing that letter, at least so far as I've shown it to you? Did you agree with it or disagree with it?
I think it felt not very satisfactory.
In what way?
That it wasn't a sufficient response to the concerns raised by the Commissioner.
Now, given the trail of correspondence we've looked at, would I be right in thinking that the LFB did not agree that requirement B4 and supporting guidance explicitly stated, using her words, that external walls should adequately resist the spread of fire in their own right?
Well, from the correspondence that you've already shown me, I read the sentence and I was surprised at how emphatic it was, which didn't feel congruent with what we've already looked at.
Yes, thank you. Now, if we look at the email chain, we'll come back to this letter in due course on the subject of the external wall and the RRO. But if we look at the email chain which surrounds this, can we go to LFB 20121100? You can see from the bottom half of the page, it needs to be blown up, it's a bit small, but you can see that Sue Marshall, who I think is is said to be the PA to the Commissioner, sends you an email, as well as Gary Reason and Dave Brown and Steve Cherrick and others, on the 8th of February 2013. Dear all, the Commissioner has asked me to forward you the attached for your information. You then, I think, reply to a number of senior officers if you go to the top of the email on the 18th of February, and you say, I wouldn't mind receiving some authoritative advice about what this reply amounts to. I've read it, but I am left unusually short of a view about what it all means. For other reasons, I thought David Atkinson might appreciate the statement in the letter. Quotes, unfortunately, legal definitions of common words can often result in more problems than they solve, and we, CLG, would therefore be reluctant to do this. When you say, I wouldn't mind receiving some authoritative advice about what this reply amounts to, what did you mean?
Before you displayed this, I said that my recollection was that I didn't find the response from Louise Upton very satisfactory, and this is a longer-winded version of it.
I see, OK. Did anybody give you the authoritative advice that you wanted?
I don't remember whether I received emails in response to it, no.
Right, did you follow up?
Well, the letter was, from memory, the letter was subsequently followed up. So I think subsequently we put the correspondence before members, and members took the view that it wasn't very satisfactory, and there was a further round of correspondence with DCLG. I hope I've remembered that correctly, but I think that's what happened.
I see. Did you discuss the letter with Commissioner Dobson?
I can't remember.
Now, this is February 2013. Do you know whether any consideration was given to going back to Louise Upton or to Brandon Lewis to ask for a response that properly engaged with the Brigade's concerns?
Well, I think it's likely at the Lakanal House board there was a discussion about whether at that time to make a response. That must have been, we must now have been very close to the inquest.
Well, it was halfway through the inquest.
Halfway through. Look, I don't think it was our position at the time that we thought we were pushing an open door with CLG on much of this. Concerns about the competency of fire risk assessors. I mean, you've demonstrated today that in the industry, as it were, the fire industry, people have been talking about that since shortly after the introduction of the RRO, but nothing substantive followed from it. We were influenced by our assessment that government were not interested in more layers of regulation or more layers of rules, which is not to say that we gave up on it. You can see subsequent activity to which my statement refers, which demonstrates that we didn't give up on it. I've said I don't remember seeing Ron Dobson's letter to Ken Knight in December 2009, but the response to that, was less than we probably hoped for, and this was obviously less than we hoped for, and there were probably other letters on other topics at the same time between us and DCLG where we'll be getting less than we hoped for.
Is that a long and perhaps delicate way of saying that dealing with government on this issue and trying to get your recommendations sensibly addressed was like trying to get blood out of a stone?
I'll stick with mine, not pushing at an open door.
All right. Now, let's turn to a slightly different topic, or subtopic, which is Lakanal pre-action, your own work on fire spread beyond the compartment of origin. And we start, I think, with the email chain at LFB 3096647. Now, the first email in the chain starts at the bottom of page 1 from you on the 14th of January 2013. So we're only a month or so, no, 3 weeks or so before the letter we've just seen from Louise Upton, and about a week or so after the start of the inquest hearings at Lakanal. So just that is the time point. And it's to David Wyatt and Clive Eustace. And it says, post Lakanal FS, is that fire safety?
Yes.
Yeah. We're asked to, quotes, review of high-rise fires where fire spreads beyond the compartment, close quotes. Apparently, no such incidents could be identified. Would you please just double-check IMS records for me? Would I be right in thinking that IMS stands for Information Management System?
Yes.
Right. Now, the request that fire safety review high-rise fires where fire spreads beyond the compartment of origin was, as we saw earlier, I think, item 20 of the 34 Lakanal pre-actions, as I've called them. Yes. Yes?
I can't remember if it was 20, but I believe so, yes. Yes.
And had been identified by the Lakanal board. And we've looked at that before. Just for reference purposes, for those who want to go back to it, it's LFB 3055192, page 8, minutes of the 15th of September 2010 meeting. Now, why was that identified as an internal action following the Lakanal House fire? We touched on this before, but it's clearly you've picked it up now in early 13. Do you know why it was identified as an internal action after the fire?
Because the because of the knowledge of the fire spread in the building and based on emerging findings as reported by the fire investigation team.
Do you know what had prompted you to send this email on the 14th of January 2013?
It's the kind of thing I did. On the one hand, I get an action plan which says the answer to this question is this, and sometimes I took it away and probed a bit harder. Now,
we know that David Wyatt, from the email above it, was Head of Information and Management and Performance. That was his role. What was Clive Eustace's role?
Clive works for David, so they were both very involved in the creation and maintenance of information management systems.
Now,
and Clive was useful because he was a former operational firefighter.
I see. Just going back to my previous question, I asked you why was this identified, or what prompted you to send this email? You say it's the kind of thing I did. I mean, it's a very specific issue, spread of fire beyond the compartment of origin. Can you remember what it was, what was happening at the time, which prompted you to ask this question?
It would, in answering you, it would be helpful for me to know what was recorded in the action plan as the action taken. I have a recollection that Steve went, as it were, international in his reply, but I'm not certain. You'll have the action plan with the response in the action plan that Steve offered. I must have known at that point, because I was responsible for the information management division, amongst other reasons, that there was a data field about fire where fire spreads beyond the compartment, and so I would have known that I could ask the information people to extract some data from those data fields.
Yes, and just following on from that, was there a view within the LFB at that time, so early 2013, that this type of fire spread beyond the compartment of origin was a historical problem in London which had not been grasped?
I think I said earlier, Mr. Millett, I think this problem of spread beyond the compartment is complicated. So it might have spread beyond the compartment because there was a hole in the door, or because there was because pipes had been fitted and the fire stopping around them was inadequate, or it might be because a more fundamental systemic problem with the building as a whole. So there was a huge spectrum of reasons why fire spread beyond the compartment, and quite often in our records it was about buildings which were the subject of works, so they were big culprits for fires in which fire spread beyond the compartment. So I think if one asks for the data from the team, tell me something about fire spread beyond the compartment, you get from memory you get 5 or 6 different lines of different aspects of the data, and you'd need to do some work with the data to make sure that if you wanted to take it forward and understand better, you were doing so on the basis of an intelligent understanding of what the headline was.
So my question was really a headline question, leaving aside the nuances of different kinds of compartment and different kinds of fire spread, different kinds of buildings.
Yes.
Your question is, if FS were asked to review high-rise fires where fire spreads beyond the compartment, and my question is, given the way you asked the question, was there a view within the LFB at the time that fire spread beyond the compartment of origin, whatever the cause, whatever the nuances, was a historical problem which had not been grasped?
No, that's actually, now you've asked me that question in the context of this email, I can see that what one might think that's what was happening, but no, it was a more innocent question about, tell me what you can see from the data.
Yes, and that's why I asked you why you asked the question. Why were you concerned?
Because I knew the data existed, because I knew the data was there, and I went to the Information Management Division daily, literally daily, and said, tell me more about this, tell me more about that, look up the data, tell me more. It was not an unusual thing for me to do, quite the reverse.
What were you after?
After...
you were after data, but what did you want to know? What did you want to learn from the data?
What did I want to learn from the data? I wanted to see some numbers. So I'm far from this. I mean, you haven't shown me the action plan with whatever was recorded as the action taken. But I've already said, I was reading all the fire investigation reports by this time, and I could see there were instances of breach of compartmentation or spread beyond the compartment identified in fire investigation reports. So it probably struck me that no such incidents could be identified was unlikely. But to give Steve Terrick his due, it could be that in one sense, he answered a more intelligent question than the simple one. How many fires spread beyond the compartment? So I was kind of going back to basics, I suppose. Whereas, it's possible that Steve approached the question in a more sophisticated way than that.
Well, what did you want to learn from the numbers you were after?
I wanted to get some feel for the extent to which it was a regular phenomenon.
And was that prompted by a view within the LFB that fire spread beyond the compartment of origin was not a one-off at Lakanal, but very likely to be far more common?
It was far more common, but for a really wide range of reasons.
Now, can we go to LFB 3033943, which is a report entitled Review I'll just wait till it comes up. There it is. It's review of the Lakanal Action Plan, 4th of January 2013. First, do you recall seeing that report at the time?
I don't recall it at the time, but I've certainly seen it as part of the disclosure process for today.
So
I don't remember back in January 2013.
Right. Can you confirm for us, and we've got there from the documents, that this report was drafted by Group Manager David Lindridge, who was seconded to operational assurance, and this is in effect a summary of the Brigade's work on the 34 Lakanal actions at that point?
I believe this was a draft. On the 4th of January, I believe it was a draft. I believe it was sent to me by Gary Reason, who said, here's the latest draft, we will be discussing it, and I followed it up.
Right. Was it this report that prompted your follow-up email to Clive Eustace and David Wyatt about fire spread beyond the compartment of origin, do you think?
The timing is suggestive that that's likely.
Right.
But I can't be certain.
You can't be certain. All right.
No.
Now, let's look at page 15, please, where we can see a box headed Action Reference 20. Now, you'll remember from the annex to the 15th of September 2010 Lakanal Board minutes that item 20 was compartment fires, or spread of fire beyond the compartment of origin. We looked at that before. Here we have Action Reference 20, Responsible Department Officer, Fire Safety Regulation, AC Turek and DAC Lee Philpotts. Entry on Action Log. You can see review of high-rise fires where fire spreads beyond the compartment. Expected outcome, identify recorded fires which could have produced a learning opportunity prior to 3rd July 2009. Review process findings, a senior officer with a health and safety specialism conducted a document search of fires within LFB and other UK FRSs. An experienced fire investigator sent a request to an international fire safety organisation with a similar intention. Both searches identified no such incidents. This outcome has been included in the FI report. We've seen no documents recording the LFB's research or the study. And none appear in the Brigade's fire investigation report. Take that from me. Do you know whether a report or review note was drafted as a result of this work?
No.
Going back to the email we were looking at earlier, if we can, LFB 30966647, which you sent to David Wyatt and Clive Eustace, just moving up the email chain, your request, as we've seen, was to double-check the records, the IMS records. You see that at the foot of the page, yes?
Yes.
Yes, you laughed. Does it trigger a recollection?
No.
Right.
Sorry, it confirms, I hope, what I was trying to explain, which is, I did Steve did something appropriate and intelligent with his team, but it didn't fully satisfy me. I wanted us to dig into our data.
Yes. I mean, in asking, will you please just double-check IMS records for me, was that because you had doubts about the research that had been undertaken by the Fire Safety Department?
No. But if somebody had asked me, if you went back to Action 20, if somebody had asked me to do that, I would have done the thing that I did. But I probably wouldn't have done the thing that Steve did. Steve did a thing that looked higher level than the thing that I did or was interested in doing. He tackled the question in a different way. I just wanted a different perspective on it based on some, very high-level data that we had in our information management systems.
Well, when you said in the email, apparently no such incidents could be identified, was that a reference to what we've seen in Action 20 attached at page 15 to the...
I think so, yes.
Thank you. That's helpful. Now, can we just then go on up the page? In the email directly above, David Wyatt responds to you, and he says, we are able to do this based on property type and fire spread in IMS, and will produce some data.
Yeah.
And in the next email up above that, Clive Eustace writes to you a little bit later the same day, in fact 7 minutes later, who told you there were none, the criteria could not be identified, please? Seems like a very lazy response to me. I asked Ian, and he will give Rhianna the criteria, and we'll have any such incidents in a report by the end of today, I expect. Now, we've seen no emails between you, Mr. Wyatt, and Mr. Eustace, nor the promised report. Do you know what the outcome of that investigation was? That investigation of the IMS?
They will have provided data without a doubt. So I think it would be fair to say I always had a Rolls-Royce service from the information management team. They will have sent me some data. And I've seen data more recently as part of this process, and I don't know whether that was a copy of what I had in 2013, or it may be that I asked for data myself more recently.
In what form do you remember that data came to you?
It had been a table, so IMS generally generated tables, lines of data. So it'll have given me an annual figure for a number of years, maybe 4 or 5. I don't remember, and it will have. So it's based on property type. So it'll have told me whether it was a dwelling. It will have used the property type categories that were in IMS, which were always a bit frustrating to my mind. So by property type, probably gave me data for a 5-year period, and it will have given me the breakdown that was in IMS about, whether it was building and construction, for example. So there have been 4 or 5 lines of data. There's probably a drop-down menu. So if fire investigation tick breach of compartmentation as part of their investigation, when they're filling in the form, they'll then get, I think, a drop-down menu saying, tell me a bit more based on these, based on specified categories.
And how would that information have come to you? Would it come by email?
I think, yeah, probably.
So we've not been able to find any further emails on this subject between you and Mr. Eustace or Mr. Wyatt. But from the best of your recollection, is this right, that you got further emails with that information attached to it that you had asked for?
Yes.
And do you remember whether it was long after lunchtime on the 14th of January 2013? Did you have to wait a few days for it? Do you remember?
It's not very likely. It will have taken them minutes to generate a report from the system.
So just to help us with what we're looking for in your disclosure, or the LFB's disclosure, we're looking for an email on the 14th or around the 14th of January 2013, which has an attachment from the IMS, which came to you.
Yes.
Right. Now, do you know whether, as well as interrogating the IMS system, as you'd asked, inquiries were made by the investigation team of any other fire and rescue services as to their own experience of fire spread beyond the compartment of origin?
Mr. Millett, you showed us what they said, and I simply can't remember whether that included that.
Well, we can go back to 20. Let's do that.
So I only know what they did based upon what was contained in that draft action plan.
Right.
I don't know anything beyond or outside that.
Right. Now, there were a number of fires in the UK before Lakanal which had involved fire spread, external fire spread, and I just want to ask you about a few of those. First, were you aware during your time as Deputy Commissioner of the fire at Garnock Court in Irvine in Scotland in June 1999?
I was aware of it, yes.
Were you aware of the fire at Knowsley Heights in Liverpool in April 1991?
I'd certainly heard of it, yes.
Yes. And what about the fire at Harrow Court in Stevenage in February 2005?
Yes, I'd heard of that.
And do you agree that the information about those particular fires should have been identified as learning points for the LFB, either at the time they happened, but in any event after the Lakanal House fire in July 2009?
I'd like to think so, yes.
Yes. Can you explain why they were not?
I don't know that they were not. So I don't know whether Peter Cowap in operational procedures will have looked at, I've forgotten which the third one was, Mr. Millett, but
Stevenage, Harrow Court.
Harrow Court, I don't know that Peter Cowart will not have reviewed information about Harrow Court and incorporated it into what he was doing. I feel certain that Gary Reason will know. I'm clear that I recall Gary Reason talking about Harrow Court.
You answered the question, you don't know that they were not, and it is a fair point that my question implied that they were not. Let me ask it differently. From your experience on the Lakanal House board, so before the inquests in early 2013, do you remember any discussion or investigation of those fires which might inform how the LFB might respond to the Lakanal House fire?
No.
No. Now, do you remember that before Lakanal there were also international high-rise fires involving fire spread beyond the compartment of origin?
No.
You don't. So can I take it, therefore, that you were not aware of the Torre Windsor fire in Madrid, February 2005?
I wouldn't have remembered it, but I've seen in disclosure documents which suggested in 2005 I was aware of it, yes.
But I'm asking for what you knew during your time as Deputy Commissioner.
No.
Right. What about the Water Club Tower fire in Atlantic City, Jersey, in the USA in September 2007?
No.
No. Television Cultural Centre fire in Beijing, February 2009?
No. All before my time still as Deputy Commissioner.
And again, can we take it that, so far as your recollection is concerned, there was no discussion of those fires and any learning points to be derived from them when addressing the problems that had arisen at Lakanal House?
You can.
Right. Do you remember whether the Fire Safety Department or the ODCB, for that matter, ever considered conducting research into international fires or to seek to learn from overseas incidents?
No, we didn't. In 2014, when Danny Cotton became Assistant Commissioner Operational Assurance, I asked her to do a piece of work to consider whether we were having regard to the best available range of information or whether there were more things that we could be taking into account and learning from. But that work hadn't come to fruition by the time I left.
Did you ask her specifically to consider the history of domestic cladding fires in the UK and overseas?
No.
Why is that?
To be fair to her, I gave her a very outline brief. In one sense, I was wanting her to come to me with some proposals. So, I didn't start out knowing what I wanted. I wanted somebody to provide me with some advice about, things I might not have thought of or didn't know. Right.
Let's then look at the Lakanal Rule 43 letter and move this on in time. The Lakanal House inquest hearings, as I say, took place between January and March 2013. And as we now know, were ongoing at the time of your discussions on pre-action number 20 and the correspondence with Louise Upton at the DCLG. The inquest hearings finished in March 2013, and at the conclusion on the 28th of March 2013, the coroner sent what are known as Rule 43 letters, which contained recommendations that the coroner considered would eliminate or reduce the risk of deaths. And those were sent to a number of organisations, including the LFB and the DCLG. And I've given you a little potted history. Is there anything I've just said with which you disagree?
No.
Right. Now, the coroner's letter to the Brigade we find at LFB 3032158. And if you go to the first page, you can see that it's dated the 28th of March 2013, sent to the Commissioner, dear Mr. Dobson, Lakanal House Fire, 3rd of July 2009. And there's a reference to the narrative verdicts on the first page. And if you go to page 2, halfway down, you can see...
I'm sorry, Mr. Millett, can you just remind me of the date of the letter?
28th of March 2013.
Okay, I didn't get there quickly enough. Okay.
And if you look halfway down page 2, you can see where she makes the recommendations. She says, I make the following recommendations. That's after the long list of bullet points. which are not on your screen. The first one is public awareness of fire safety. You see that?
Yes.
And then if we look down and scroll down, you can see the second one is visits made pursuant to section 72D, general familiarisation visits, home fire safety visits, and then incident commanders, you see in italics under that, yes?
Yes.
And then if we move over the page, brigade control,
Yes.
and then communications, yes?
Yes.
Yes. So those are the topics. And the recommendation relating to incident command training starts at the top of page 3. And if we go to the top of page 3, she says this: it is also recommended that consideration be given to training of ICs and potential ICs to enhance their performance in relation to the following. And then there are 7 bullet points set out, and they're important, so I'll read them out to you. The first is use of the dynamic risk management model and other management tools to enable ICs to analyse the situation and to recognise and react quickly to changing circumstances. Second bullet, to recognise when to escalate attendance by more experienced ICs. Third bullet, to anticipate that a fire might behave in a manner inconsistent with the compartmentation principle. Fourth bullet, to be aware of the risks to those above and adjacent to the fire flat. Fifth bullet, handover from one IC to the next and effective deployment of outgoing ICs. Sixth bullet, the collection of information from all possible sources. Seventh and final bullet, use of methodical search patterns. Now, let's, before we move on with this document, go to Ron Dobson's witness statement. At LFB 30032157, and there are 1 or 2 things in there I want to show you before asking you some questions. At page 6, please, paragraph 22, under the heading Rule 43 Recommendations, he says this: on 20th of June 2013, at a meeting of the LFIPA, I presented a report, Coroner's Inquests Following the Fire at Lakanal House on 3rd July 2009. A copy of the relevant excerpt of the meeting minutes are produced as Exhibit RJD8. A copy of the report is produced at RJD9. As set out within the report, it was proposed that implementation of the proposed actions in response to the Rule 43 recommendations was to be monitored by the ODCB. And then he goes on in the next paragraph 23, if we can turn the page please, to say this: as can be seen from the minutes of the meeting, in addition, it was agreed that a task group would be established consisting of 3 elected members of LFIPA, 1 drawn from each political group, to undertake a review of the LFB's response to the fire at Lakanal House and to provide their recommendations into the Strategy Committee. Now, take it from me that this task group is not mentioned in the report that was presented to the LFIPA, but do you know whether it was instigated by the LFIPA members?
It was.
It was. Do you know why it was deemed necessary for the LFIPA members to undertake a review of the LFB's response to the Lakanal House fire?
Because they took such a serious view of the fire and what had occurred.
Right. And was it intended that the new Lakanal House working group would provide political oversight, scrutiny and accountability of the LFB's responses to the Lakanal House inquest coroner's Rule 43 recommendations?
Yes.
Yes. Why did the Strategy Committee have oversight of the LFB's Rule 43 actions in addition to the Lakanal House working group and the ODCB?
Because the Strategy Committee was a committee of the authority, and the Lakanal House working group was not. So it was although it was a member body attended by officers, it wasn't part of the formal structure of LFIPA, and so I think the members who proposed the working group just wanted to make sure that the work was integrated into the formal political management structures of the authority. And in one sense, the ODCB was completely separate to that. That was the officer mechanism.
Right. So just help me with this. There was the Lakanal House Working Group. There was the Strategy Committee. Yes?
Yes.
And there was the ODCB.
Yes.
Yes. Was there another?
And the Lakanal House Board, or had that finished by then?
No, well, that was discontinued.
Okay.
There may have been an element of overlap in timing terms, but it was discontinued, and the work of the board, as it were, segued into the LHWG. My question was: was there a duplication of work as between the Lakanal House Working Group and the Strategy Committee?
As an officer, I'd say there was, yes, and
Yeah.
and it was difficult and a bit frustrating at the time. But sometimes these things happen in local authorities. I'm sorry, I probably ought to have added one more thing to. I think you asked me, why did they create the Lakanal House Working Group, or you asked me a question that was, as it were, on that topic. So one of the three members was Valerie Shawcross, who I think was the leader of the authority at that time. She also had a constituency interest, so her seat as a member of the London Assembly included Southwark, and she in particular felt very passionately about what had happened at Lakanal House, and she herself wanted to be involved in a substantial piece of work to oversee the Brigade's response. So she had a very significant personal political motivation for wanting to, as it was, chair the Lakanal House Working Group.
Right. I just want to understand the structure a little bit better. The Lakanal House Working Group comprised, is this right, 3 elected members of LFIPA?
Yes.
Yes. The Strategy Committee also comprised or contained elected members?
Yes.
Yes. The ODCB was a purely LFB entity?
An officer thing, yeah.
Yes. But is it right that both the Lakanal House Working Group and the ODCB fed into the Strategy Committee? Or did the ODCB not feed into the Strategy Committee?
No, the ODCB didn't feed into the Strategy Committee. But you're right to identify there was some awkwardness in terms of the joins between the Lakanal House Working Group and the Strategy Committee. But for officers, it had amounted to an element of duplication, and it wasn't my view then or now that it exposed or left the potential for any gaps.
Right.
Yeah.
What did the Strategy Committee do that the Lakanal House Working Group did not?
It took over some of the longer term themes that when the Lakanal House Working Group ceased to meet, it took over some of the longer term themes. So from memory, there was an exchange of correspondence between Valerie Shawcross as chair of the Lakanal House Working Group and Sarah, the then chair of the Strategy Committee. They had an exchange of correspondence where Valerie Shawcross said, the Lakanal House Working Group has done this, this, this and this, but there's still more work to be done, and that ought to be taken forward by the Strategy Committee.
Right. Can we just look at your witness statement, please? Your first witness statement, paragraph 22, page 7. And you say in that paragraph, under the heading Lakanal House Working Group, that it was established by the authority at its meeting on the 20th of June 2013, as the Commissioner has said. And you say this: this was an unusual action for members to initiate, and it marked the importance they attached to the events at and after the Lakanal House fire. The working group met on 6 occasions. Its membership comprised 3 elected members of the authority, 1 from each of the main political groups, and the meeting was chaired by one of the members. Officers would attend to provide advice to the working group, principally through presentations and reports, and then you go on to explain who that was, and then on to the terms of reference. But would it be right that the 3 elected members of the authority would actually have no firefighting or operational or training experience of their own. They were just politicians. I don't say just politicians, but they were not fire.
Valerie Shawcross became chair of the authority in 2000 when the authority was created. So she'd accumulated a lot of political management experience of the work of the brigade, and I think the same is true about Maurice Hestia. And they were both. Peter Truesdale hadn't been on the authority very long, but the three of them were highly competent and well-established local authority members. They each had 20, 30 years of experience of being councillors, and so they had a very well-developed understanding of the political management responsibilities of members in relation to the work of their local authority, in this case, the London Fire Brigade.
But would it be right to say that each of them, individually and as a group, were entirely dependent upon the advice and presentations and reports given to them by those within the LFB?
No, I don't think it would be right to say that. Valerie Shawcross, in particular, was never entirely dependent on officers. She was a clever, fierce woman who, had lots of ability. And Maurice Hestia had years and years of experience as a senior Wandsworth councillor. I think Peter Truesdale did in his authority too. So, they were a ferocious group to work for. No, I wouldn't say they were entirely dependent upon what we serve them.
Ferocious and experienced is one thing.
Yes.
What I'm really asking for is that when it came to formulating the responses to the recommendations, the Rule 43 recommendations, when it came to formulating them and identifying what in practice could and should happen, they were entirely dependent upon what they were told by the LFB. For example, what training was happening in response, what was being developed. They wouldn't know that themselves. They'd have to be told that.
Indeed, but that's how it works.
Indeed. Now let's look at the the minutes of the first meeting of the Lakanal House Working Group, 24th of July 2013 at LFB 3050526. Now, you can see the date, you can see the notes, you can see the time, you can see the members, Maurice Hestia, Valerie Shawcross and Peter Truesdale, the names you've just given us, and the officers who were present, Ron Dobson, Gary Reason, Steve Turek, Tim Cutbill, and some others. You're not there. Do you know why you weren't there?
I don't, Mr. Millett, no.
Was Steve Turek effectively deputising for you?
No, I didn't have a, as it were, system of deputies. So he was there because fire safety regulation was so central to Lakanal House. Right.
Now, the working group's terms of reference are set out under item 2, as you can see, or you can't quite see. Can we please scroll down and we'll have them in full. Terms of reference noted as agreed by the authority at its meeting on 20th of June to undertake a review of the Brigade's response to the fire at Lakanal House and to feed recommendations back to the Strategy Committee. So the Strategy Committee had already been set up by this time, presumably?
Yes, that was the standing committee, yes.
That's the standing committee, right. Under item 4 we can see a list of possible items for the work programme. You can see there, first bullet point, ongoing updates on Rule 43 Action Plan, also to be reported regularly to the Strategy Committee. Victim support, Fire Safety Regulatory Reform Order is one of the bullets. Incident Command, capture and use of premises-based information, fire safety info for residents in high-rise blocks. Do you know why the working group was interested in undertaking work on the RRO, third bullet point down? Do you know why that was part of the work programme?
Because by this time, we had begun to form a view that for some of the reasons that we've already discussed and some that we haven't yet discussed or may never discuss, that the RRO had deficiencies. And I want to say some of those were important in the context of Lakanal, but I'm anxious that you'll ask me which ones and I won't immediately bring them to mind. But we thought the RRO was problematic and we wanted to explore that further with members.
Right. Was that linked specifically to the recommendations? I ask because it's not apparent from the letter that it was.
The recommendations from the coroner?
Yes.
No, I think you're right to make that point. I think that's correct.
So the Lakanal House Working Group was actually looking at slightly wider, connected, picked up,
yes.
but slightly wider issues than simply the Rule 43 response and its quality.
Yes.
Yes.
So the Rule 43 response, for example, didn't deal with victim support, as I recall.
Indeed.
But Valerie Shawcross was really interested to deal with victim support.
Indeed. And do you know who put Fire Safety Regulatory Reform Order on the list?
We certainly agreed between the officers, it'll be somewhere between Steve Turek and I, in all probability. Right.
And I know you weren't at the meeting, but was the list of bullet points for the work programme that we've just looked at something that you discussed before the meeting, even though you weren't at the meeting?
We, the officers, certainly did, yes.
Right.
We will have prepared the report which proposed a work programme.
Right. Mr. Chairman, uncharacteristically, this might be a moment to take the break. I'm going to turn to a different document, which I will certainly not finish by 1 o'clock. And it's
better to break now rather than in the middle of a line of questions.
Exactly. Thank you.
All right. Well, we'll take a break at this stage, Ms. Dexter. We'll resume, please, at 2 o'clock. And again, please don't speak to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it when you're out of the room. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. 2 o'clock, then, please.